So over the past few weeks, I've been creating a rather extensive series of space-time travel machines and experiments using, largely using, but collections of data sets that I allow myself and my audience to transform into collections of material loci, that is, points that can be articulated in material terms that exist in space-time and that can be relocated by simple means to other materially based loci that exist in space-time. And in the process of moving from one locus to another, my contention is that I've performed a kind of space-time travel. And it has occurred to me that someone could argue that what I am doing largely depends merely on memory, and that one could extend the argument that I've made implicitly in my space-time travel experiments, that all forms of memory that relate a collection of narrative or material details in one space-time location, from childhood perhaps, or for example, from a specific election to another election, say a current election, are examples of space-time travel. And I would argue against that general application of the principle, because the movement has been made, singularly by the mind. The mind connects the two moments in space and time analogously, and memory serves the function of moving them together and creating meaning out of the relationship of those forms. And it's some might say that's a trivial distinction, and perhaps it is a trivial distinction. But it's not a machine, is it? It's rather a fantasy. So I'm not willing to say that those are not space-time travel fantasies, but I wouldn't go so far as to say they're space-time travel machines. So to distinguish the difference between what I have been doing and calling space-time travel machines, space-time travel experiences, space-time travel experiments, with this sort of engagement with memory and analogy, I'm going to perform a different memory experiment today. And, one could call it a space-time travel fantasy if one liked, but I probably won't. I'm going to call it, something. This is not a space-time travel machine. Playing with another one of the pieces that I've done recently, and that refers to some work that I did a few decades earlier. So I'll call this something like this is not a space-time travel machine, or this is not a space-time travel experiment. We'll see how it works out as the improvisation of the memory experiment proceeds. So that having been said, something recently, and I'll hold off on examining what that is, something recently inspired a memory for me. And I'll narrate the memory, and then I'll relate it analogously to what inspired the memory, and kind of sort out those different collections of ideas and thoughts and ruminations. But when I was a child, I remember my grandparents and my uncle. My grandparents were fruit farmers in Central California, who had both had grown up in Oklahoma area and Kansas, moved around a bit, and they were Mennonite farmers there. And then when the Great Depression hit, and when they were faced with the famine in the Dust Bowl, their families moved from Kansas to to California, and they settled there and continued farming. My uncle was a postal worker, but had largely inherited the conservative values of these sort of white Christian farmers, and which isn't really important, except that it'll come up, it'll become relevant in the details in which the analogous relationship between the memory that I have and the moment that inspired the memory fit together. So we were they together, they owned, my grandparents and my uncle together, they had purchased a cabin in the Sequoia Woods, which was not too far by car from where my grandparents' farm was, and they had given my uncle some land on their farm to build a house, and he had built a house and settled there with his family, and his job was that he was a postal worker, so he worked for the U.S. government. And they had bought this cabin, and it was a sort of a vacation and weekend getaway, and they liked to go up in the summer in particular, but also in the winter as well. In fact, in the winter they had to go up and clear the roof of snow, or if that wasn't accomplished, then the cabin would collapse. It was really lovely. One of my favorite early experiences of the world was visiting Sequoia, and I remember when my grandparents and I would go up together, we would have to bring our own food, and my grandmother would always remind me, please don't eat anything that isn't marked with our name, even though Dennis was their child. They had to bring their own food because he'll get angry that we've eaten his food. So I always had to be careful that I didn't eat my uncle's food. I never really cared for my uncle all that much. He seemed to me like that he was sort of cruel. He was an alcoholic, and had one of these sort of malignant tempers, and always finding fault with everything. There was an incident at one Christmas gathering where my mother had said something that he disapproved of, and he pulled the chair out from under her. I remember I was about 6 years old maybe. I remember being frightened, that harm would come to her. He was, very much one of these angry individuals that take their anger out on those around them rather, continually and consistently. So, anyway, we were at the cabin, and we were having whatever would have constituted a kind of family dinner, although my mother was a single parent, and there was a lot of judgment, so she was never invited to one of these gatherings, and she wasn't there, but my grandparents were there, and they were playing the part of my guardian, and my uncle and his family were there, and I don't know how the discussion turned to education, but it did. And it specifically turned to educational testing, which is probably one of the reasons why I thought of this memory, because I've been doing some space-time travel experiments that involve the idea of testing, aptitude testing, and I've applied some of those space-time travel experiments metaphorically and conceptually to other kinds of testing, cognitive testing, referencing the cognitive test that Trump was so proud that he had passed, not realizing, of course, that it was a dementia test, which kind of ironically pointed to the fact that whether he had, quote unquote, passed the dementia test or not, that there was clearly something wrong with his understanding, or he would have understood the nature of the test and probably not been so eager to brag about the results. But in any case, we were discussing, education and testing, and at this time, IQ was something that had some value, and this was in the early 70s, and Richard Nixon was president, and and I had taken recently one of my first IQ tests, intelligence quotient tests, and the score that I received on that test granted me access to an educational program, which at that time was called MGM, and it mentally gifted minors. Later it became things like GATE and different kinds of programs like that. But it was one of the things that I liked best about my early education. What we did in the program that I had with a teacher named Mrs. Call were largely project-based work, and they were wonderful. We designed cities. We studied individual species of birds, and the projects were designed around. I remember making a topographical map of the area that my city was located. I remember making charts of the way that economy functioned in that city. And this was all around the time that I was in early grade school. So, second to third or perhaps fourth grade. And really, really quite remarkable. The ornithology was related back to state symbols and metaphors of prosperity. So every state has a bird. So our birds had to be chosen among the state birds, and then we learned how to make their nests, and then we built their nests. These are the kinds of projects that we did. So really quite remarkable. And let me go back to the scene. The scene is that we're sitting around the dining room table. We're having, I don't remember what, maybe let's just say that it was chicken. It may or may not have been chicken. Honestly, I don't remember what it was. And we're discussing these forms of testing. And no one's really talking about the way that these tests are sorting mechanisms, and that they're designed, to sort, human individuals into, categories that designate levels of opportunity and abilities to either participate in programs or exclusion from those programs, and access to resources or exclusion from access to those resources. No one's talking about those kinds of issues that a real educator would talk about in dealing with testing and sorting, but they're not real educators. In fact, like I said, they're farmers and they're proponents of these conservative values, and this is the context for the situation. So everyone is, and I don't know how all of the members of our group, and I remember my grandparents didn't, but the other members of our group are discussing their IQs, and I suppose they must have been tested. And Dennis is very proud of his IQ, which is somewhere around 120 or something here. He's claiming that it is, and he never seemed very smart to me, even when I was a child. And I'm kind of doubting his I'm sort of doubting the numerical values that he's claiming, but I'm also not particularly impressed by them. And I mentioned what the value, my numerical value was, having just taken the test and being having a good memory of what it was, and I remember I was really hurt and offended. He laughed, he laughed at this, and he didn't think that it was possible that I had this high IQ. And I remember him saying something like, "Well, how can someone who can barely even write his own name have an IQ that high?" And of course, he was referring to my dysgraphia and my difficulty handwriting. And which I still have, and as viewers of my YouTube page will recognize, that I still have today, and that continues to be a problem in certain situations. For example, I've returned to Arizona, and I have to get a new Arizona driver's license, and I have to re-register my vehicle. And there's a lot of paperwork to fill out, and of course it's very difficult. So I enlisted the help of my wife, and we did a lot of it online. In fact, she did most of it, and then and it's largely like pre-filled out so that I won't have to engage handwriting as part of the performance of my request to change this type of information. So it continues to be a problem, and this was, evidence for him, that I wasn't, an intelligent individual. And I recall that he said, no one has an IQ that high. Well, maybe President Nixon. And I'm aware that, it's been claimed that, Nixon was intelligent. And if you believe in IQs, which I don't particularly at this time, I probably did then. But so I am aware of those types of claims, but I'm also aware of the way that they participate in a kind of ideological distortion of the value of individuals in terms of a lot of prejudices that we have around the patriarch and figure of authority. So I very much understood that Dennis, that's my uncle's name, wanted Richard Nixon to be a very intelligent individual because he had voted for him, because his values were representative of what my uncle's were, and because he was, in some sense, the new father of our country, right? And so he had this role of status, and this role of status should coincide with intelligence. Well, as we know, these coincidences of status, and political and social and economic hierarchy, rarely coincide with human intelligence. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, he thinks I can't be intelligent. Dennis, my uncle, thinks I can't be intelligent because I have such poor handwriting. And, we didn't know the word dysgraphia at the time. When I was going to school, there wasn't dyslexia, maybe, but no one spoke of this idea of dysgraphia. So it's really a relatively unknown thing. So look, whatever it was just that I wasn't smart, right? And then if you have difficult handwriting, people aren't going to bother to look at what you've actually said or written, because why would they bother to decipher that? It's obvious that the child isn't intelligent, right? So I understood that, and I understood also, I didn't let Dennis know, but I thought that Dennis's idea that Richard Nixon must have this awesome IQ simply because he was president, and simply because his ideological values coincided with my uncle's. I also thought that wasn't a very intelligent approach to intelligence, meaning that I didn't think that was a particularly useful, unexamined rubric for making a claim of intelligence, and I still don't think so. So that was a moment that marked, a judgment of my uncle's intelligence based upon the way that he articulated and formulated an idea of the intelligence of others. So I judged him for that, and not positively. And the reason that this memory, came into my mind, and the reason that I don't think that it's an example of space-time travel is because, I had recently been reading two articles in NPR, and both of these articles refer to the action of this Florida governor, who, it seems to me, is not particularly intelligent. And I'll explain why I don't think that this governor is particularly intelligent, and the way that judgment of this individual, in some ways, is probably what recalled my judgment of my uncle's lack of intelligence. Okay, so this governor, his name is he's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and the reason that I thought that there was something going on with his poor judgments and his lack of ability to reason is because, and many of my viewers will realize that Florida is now the epicenter of the escalation of the COVID virus in the United States, and the hospitals are filled, and patients are dying. Here's this is from the NPR site. So COVID-19 patients currently occupy 19% of ICU beds in the United States. In Florida, it's mostly 44%. Okay, so that's twice the national rate, and only about 11% of the state's ICU beds are available. So it's not only that it's double, but clearly, like, the state has no resources to handle the overload and have been poorly efficient at, or one could say completely inefficient, if one wanted to exaggerate only and hyperbolize only slightly, at responding to the crisis, right? So this says the cases are also on the rise among children. Okay, which that in and of itself is enough to be concerning. Children, as you are aware, children under 12 cannot be vaccinated for the COVID virus. So for children under 12, and this is the point, for children under 12, there really is no choice, right? There is no choice because vaccinations are not available. So if children under 12 want to go to school, and if the parents of children under 12 want them to go to school, they have to trust that they'll be protected by other means than the vaccination, since they can't be vaccinated, since vaccination is not a choice, because no vaccine has been developed that's safe for children under 12 years old. So these parents and these children who want to go to school need to rely on the protection of older and more intelligent individuals to come up with ways of making the situation of education safe for them, since they cannot be vaccinated. But since they are our children, they must be protected, right? So that to me is a reasonable kind of way of thinking. That's what I think. And maybe it's because I think of it as reasonable. But it seems to me that we are, as adults, responsible for our children. It seems to me that part of that responsibility is education, and part of that responsibility is keeping them healthy, safe, and alive. It seems to me that evidence that comes from these kinds of sources that say rises in cases among children should be taken seriously. And it seems that evidence that at least 135 children being hospitalized with COVID-19 is evidence that this is a danger, right? So here's the reason that I think that this individual is not particularly intelligent. I'm sure that he signs his name very well, and he may be, he's undoubtedly a better speller than I am. That said, as several school boards contemplated re-implementing protective measures for students returning to classrooms this fall, Governor Ron DeSantis issued an executive order at the end of the last month prohibiting mask mandates in school, despite the rise in cases and hospitalizations. So now another article details that any superintendent or supervisor of one of these schools who actually requires masks in the schools can be, their salary can be withheld from them, and they can be prosecuted as well as denied their salary. So this is an incentive for failing to require and mandate the wearing of masks in school. And the rationale is that parents have the right not to vaccinate their children, and parents, above 12 years old, right? This is part of the thing, and have the right to allow their children not to wear masks. Have the right to tell their children perhaps not to wear masks. So it's the parents and the children who decide, not the doctors or the superintendents, whether these children will wear masks. And then my point regarding the 12-year-old who has no defense against the virus but wants to go to school and can't take, or under 12-year-old, and can't have the vaccination, is that this child effectively has to stay home from school if he wants to protect himself and if his parents want to protect him. So a decision has been made that the right of a parent to determine that their child does not have to wear a mask, right, overrides, or we could say trumps, the right of the parent to determine their child is free from an authority that designates the need to wear a mask, trumps the rights of the parent to protect their child from a potentially deadly illness in the schools, and that those parents who choose to protect their children no longer have the right to have their children educated in a safe and healthy environment. And that seems unintelligent to me. And that definition of rights seems as awkward and misdirected as my uncle's idea of what constituted an intelligent individual and evidence of intelligence. And it's that analogy that brought into my mind the memory of that particular instance at the table. But that analogy occurred as a result of my conceptualizations and my mind's way of thinking and of moving through like and unlike ideas. And that is not a machine. That is a fantasy, right? Now that fantasy of connection doesn't make the process, the conceptualizations within the process, any less real than the space-time experiment. But it's not, I would argue, an example of a machine.